When building any B2B SaaS, a baseline feature you're going to need is the ability for a user under a single account to exist within multiple organizations and make changes within those organizations. Now, just as a very simple example, we have John Doe here under this one Gmail account, right? And he exists in 3 different organizations, and he also has different levels of access control there, so different roles. So I'm going to be showing you today how to do that in Next.js using Next-Auth, now known as Auth.js. So before we dive into the code, I'm going to show you the 2 most common ways to implement this and explain to you why this URL/path-based way is the best way to go. So option 1 here is we store the current organization that we're authed into in the session cookie or local storage or somewhere else like that in some sort of key value store. So a pro of this is that we're not going to add anything extra into the URL, and then all of our information regarding auth is in one place, especially if we're storing it within the cookie or the session as we do in Auth.js. However, the biggest con of this implementation is that you can only be authenticated into a single tenant or organization at a time, because this organization ID here, it's just a string, right? And if we're going to be making any changes, pinging any endpoints, we need to know exactly what organization we're in, and thus this can only have one value at a time. So if a user opens multiple windows, they're going to have to perform actions in a single organization throughout all of them, and that is the only option. The second approach is a URL or path-based approach. So in our URL, we can append some sort of unique ID. So for instance, maybe Acme's ID is org1. And as you can see, this is really just a catch-all, right? So it can be anything, and we just need to set an organization, and that's how we're actually going to identify what organization we're working with. So the pros here is you can exist in multiple tenants in multiple tabs, right? So you can open multiple Chrome tabs or whatever. You can be in Acme's org, you can be in Bar LLC's org, and you can perform actions in them without having to swap back and forth, unlike the cookie or local storage-based approach. However, it is slightly more complicated to figure out which organization you're auth into, but I'll show you that it's really not that bad, especially in Next.js. So this is going to be the general layout of our Next.js app. So we're going to be using the app directory, of course. We're going to have this org unique ID catch-all root where all of our organization's pages are going to go in there. So it could be, slash dashboard, slash settings, whatever. We're going to have our organization's page where a user can just see which organizations they belong into, and then also click a button to actually jump into the dashboard or some other page. We have our Next-Auth root, of course, and then our middleware file, which we will be using to tell our API endpoints which organization we want to make changes to, essentially. And besides that, we have our schema file, since we're using Prisma, just to simplify things. But these are pretty much all of the core folders and roots that we're going to be working with. Now, before we get started, just make sure to run npm install in this repository, and then we're also going to run this docker build command to build the image we're going to be using for our Postgres database. And then we're also going to be using the docker run command here to actually start it. And finally, we need to push our Prisma schema. So just run this command here. We're going to update our database, and everything's going to be set to go. All right, great. So now that everything's set up, let's just take a quick look around at our project here. So very basic stuff. App directory. We have some server actions here, some components, some config, and our Prisma folder. So let's begin by just looking at our schema here. So all of these models, besides the organization and user organization model, are provided by Next-Auth by default. So we can look at them, very basic stuff. All we really need here for this user object is this ID and perhaps the name. And then if we look at organization, this is custom that we've made. We have an ID, a name, an owner ID, and then also this unique ID, which will be used to identify the organization in the URL. On top of that, we have this junction table here, user organization, that specifies membership of a user in a given organization. And you can see this is commented out, but you can also add a role here or anything else like that. Maybe it's an array of strings, actually, if you want to do some sort of scoped approach. But we're going to comment this out for now just to keep things simple. But this is where you would also add the user's role. Now that we've looked at the schema file, let's just take a look at the Next-Auth config real quick. This is all pretty basic stuff that's in the Next-Auth documentation. We have this Prisma adapter here so that it can work with our database and then add those user objects automatically when an account is created, and handle any magic link codes that need to be sent as well. We have this custom resend provider here just to make things simple in development, where instead of actually sending an email, we're just going to console log the URL. And we also have this create user event where we just create these organizations in our database just for testing purposes. And of course, in production, you would remove this stuff, but this is just for demonstration purposes. And this function just generates a unique ID that we can use, given every single organization needs to have a unique identifier, of course. Now, before we look at the actual code that handles this multi-tenancy, let me just show you how this application works. Very simple. On the root page, we have this login form. I'll just add my email there. It says check your email, but of course, we're actually console logging it. So we can take a look, click on this, and we're going to be authenticated. So these are the two dummy organizations we created in the events.create callback in the Next.Auth config. And we have org1 and org2 here, right? And we also have the sign up button. So let's take a look at this organization. So as you can see, this organization's unique ID is just org, right? And maybe we'll change this so the name is org123123. We'll save it. This triggers a server action, and also this is just an alert for some visual feedback. And you'll see that the path is revalidated and the organization's name is changed. Now, of course, this has nothing to do with the unique ID, but this is just to show you how we can trigger server actions and have that server action know what organization we want to be editing. So we can go back to the organizations page and we can do the same thing for org2. As you saw there, the name was updated. We can say new name, save it, and then just like that, this org, in this new org1 slug has been edited. And we can go back here and we have org123123 and new. So let's first take a look at this layout file, which is in the org unique ID folder. And we'll see how this works and how we're actually deciding if a user can exist within an organization or not. So as we're using Next-Auth v5, which is in beta right now, we just have this single auth function, which is exported from this Next-Auth constructor. And we extract the unique ID from the parameters. And note that we have to await this because we're also using Next.js 15. So basic stuff, if the user doesn't exist or they're not logged in, we're just going to redirect them. And then we extract the user ID here. And then we use Prisma to look in our organizations table and see if there exists an organization with this unique ID and the user organization relation has this user ID, right? So that means, does the organization exist and is the user a member of this organization? Now, if we had enabled that roles in the user organization right here, for instance, if we had this role here and maybe we had, member, admin, billing admin, and maybe you wanted to restrict that layout to be only, admins can view it, right? We'd also add that check here. So, role, we'd make sure it was an admin, but we're not doing that today. We're just showing the multi-tenancy without the role-based access control. So if that org doesn't exist, that means either the organization doesn't exist or the user does not exist within that organization, and we can redirect them. And then finally, we just map the name here, and then we have the children because this is a layout file. Now, in our organizations page, you'll see that this is a very basic example of how we're finding which organizations a user belongs to. So we just use Prisma, query all the user organization relations, include the organization, and make sure that the user ID matches. So now that we've looked at the layout file, let's actually take a look at the page file, which contains that form and button that we use to update that organization information. So once again, we're extracting the unique org ID from the params, and then we are calling auth and looking for the organization where the user exists in it and also has the unique ID. Now, it's very easy to think that we can skip the step where we check for the user membership within an organization. However, that layout file is actually only going to run once, essentially, if the rest of our navigation is client-side. So just for extra security and preventing abuse from bad actors, we want to always check the user's existence within an org. And also if we have roles, we want to check that the user has that correct role. We have to actually look in our database and validate that every single time. So we pass this organization to our dashboard right here, which has this handle save function, which is triggered by the button down here, and it calls this server action. So we're just going to get the name from this input right here, right? And we pass in the default value from this organization, and we're going to trigger this server action. And this is where we actually need to do some extra work to let our server action know what organization we are acting on behalf. So just as we've seen, we're going to call auth. We're going to make sure that the user is logged in, right? And then we get this unique organization ID header right here, which seems to come out of nowhere, right? And if it doesn't exist, we're going to redirect them. And then we look for an organization where it matches this unique organization ID. And we should actually include this in the query here instead of making a separate one, because that's pretty wasteful. But we can also add this right here to make sure that the user exists in the organization, and then we can actually just delete this. So my bad. I'll push that code, fix that, but just assume that this isn't here, right? Now, we actually know what organization we're working with, and then we can update that with the name, right? And then we revalidate that path. But the question is, where does this header come from, right? So actually, in our middleware file right here, we are adding it. So we take the path name of the request, and then we check if that path name corresponds to an organization, right? So there are some path names where we know it's not gonna. So that's like Next internals, API, stuff like that. But if the root is something like Acme 1 and then dashboard, it'll match this. So it'll figure out that Acme 1 is the unique ID, and then we'll return this is org route true, and then the first segment right here, which is going to be Acme 1 or something like that. So we match that, and then we append that to the headers if it exists, and then we can forward that. And the thing is, even if someone appends this header manually, that doesn't matter, because in this action right here, we're always checking for the user's existence within that organization. So if the user and their session token is not authorized to actually perform actions on behalf of this organization, we're not going to let it through. And that's why checking the user's auth and then also their existence within an organization, and then possibly their permissions within an organization on every single request, on every server component that fetches data, in every server action, every TRPC call, every just generic API endpoint, that is extremely important that you have to do it every single time. So that is the entire implementation. It's actually quite simple when you boil it down. Just as some additional notes, this logic right here is going to get extremely repetitive, right? You don't have to check auth every single time. You don't have to extract this header. You don't have to check for the user's existence within an organization. Ideally, you're going to wrap this in some sort of, higher order component, and then you're just going to call that every single time. Optionally, maybe you can pass in a role if we're going to be adding that role field to the user organization junction table. But you're going to want to extract all of this logic into something that's a little bit more easy to copy paste or just write out, right? Because this is kind of a mouthful, kind of a waste of time to do this every single time. Doesn't make any sense. And that's it. I'm going to have the code, the repository in the description. Hope you found this useful. Next video, I'm going to be talking about role-based access control and how that fits in with multi-tenancy. So you're going to see me add that role field and show you some more tips on how to actually go about this stuff.